So first, let's see what's the history of motherboard. Prior to the invention of microprocessor, the digital computer consisted of multiple printed circuit boards in a card cage case with components connected by a backplane. Uh, in a very old design, copper wires were the discrete connection between the card connector pins, but printed circuit boards soon became the standard practice. The CPU, memory, and the peripherals were housed on individually printed circuit boards, which were plugged into backplane. The most popular computer of the 1980s, such as Apple II, IBM PC, had published schematic diagram and other documentation which permitted rapid reverse engineering and third-party replacement of motherboards. Now let's see what motherboard actually is. A motherboard is a printed circuit board in a general purpose computer and other expandable system. It holds and allows communication between many of the crucial electronic components of system, such as central processing unit, a memory, and provides connection for other peripherals. Unlike a backplane, a motherboard usually consists of significant subsystems such as central processor, chipsets, input-output, and memory controller, interface connectors, and other components integrated for general use. Similarly, the term mainboard describes a device with single board and no additional expansion or capabilities, such as controlling boards, laser printers, television set, etc. There are various types of motherboard, like standard ATX motherboard, micro ATX motherboard, extended ATX motherboard, flex ATX motherboard, low profile extended motherboard, and and many more. Uh, the design
My name is Sanskriti Auti, and I'll be explaining the storage interface, the ROM, and the basic input output system of a motherboard. Now, what are storage drives? So, storage drives are used to store data permanently or retrieve data from a media disk. They can either be installed in the computer as hard drives or removable drives, which can be connected easily through like USB ports. Now, simple examples of these drives can be hard disk drives or solid state drives, and there are many others. So that covers the storage part of the motherboard. Now coming to the ROM. ROM is short for read only memory. Now all the data which is present on ROM can't be changed, and the only way to change or replace the data is to physically remove the chip and replace it with another chip to get the new data, updated data. That in short is what ROM is. Now coming to the basic input output system. Basic input output system is a software stored in a small memory chip which is present on the motherboard. There are basically a set of instructions which are used to boost a computer. These routines provide basic driver instructions such as the keyboard, the monitor, and the mouse. And they can also provide a way for the users to edit the settings. Now, these routines test the system and assign resources to all devices which are connected to the motherboard. Now, after all these routines finish, the operating system can go ahead and take control from the output system using more complex drivers and can further the entire process. Now, these instructions are typically stored in a flash memory, so it's easy to replace or update the routines in new computers. So, this covers the storage interface, the ROM, and the basic input output system of a motherboard.
I am Avni Agashi. I am roll number 3 and I will be explaining the CPU and memory parts of the motherboard. So let us start with the CPU. As you can see on the bottom left corner of the image, we have a CPU socket, which is where the CPU is located. Now the CPU, or the central processing unit, is commonly referred to as the computer's brain. The CPU controls all the functions of a computer. CPUs are available in a variety of different form factors, each requiring a particular slot on the motherboard. A CPU can contain one or multiple cores. A CPU with a single core can only perform a single task at a time, while those with multiple cores can execute multiple tasks simultaneously. The CPU is primarily in charge of 4 tasks. The first one is fetching instructions from memory. in order to know how to handle the input and know the corresponding instructions for that particular input data which it has received. Specifically, it looks for the address of the corresponding instruction and forwards the request to the RAM. The CPU and RAM constantly work together. This is called reading from memory. Next, it decodes or translates the instructions into a form the CPU can understand, which is machine language or binary. Next, it executes and carries out the given instructions. And lastly, it stores the result of the execution back to memory for later required if necessary. The process described above is the fetch execute cycle and happens millions of times per second. Moving on to computer memory, the first type of memory that we come across is random access memory or RAM. It usually refers to computer chips that temporarily store dynamic data to enhance computer performance while working. In other words, it is the working place of the computer where active programs and data are loaded so that anytime the processor requires them, it does not have to fetch them from hard disk. This type of memory is volatile, meaning it loses its contents once power is turned off. Next, we have the BIOS, which is the basic input-output system. This is a read-only memory which consists of low-level software that controls the system hardware and acts as an interface between the operating system and hardware. So BIOS is essentially the link between computer hardware and software in a system. Lastly, we have the electrically erasable and programmable read-only memory. This is a small chip that holds bits of data code that can be rewritten and erased by an electrical charge 1 byte at a time. Its data cannot be selectively rewritten. The entire chip must be erased and rewritten to update its contents.
Hello friends, I am Jayant from Group 1 and I will be explaining some parts of motherboard. In a computer motherboard, the chipset refers to a set of integrated circuits that are responsible for managing the communication between the processor, memory, peripherals and other components. The chipset is typically divided into two main components, the North Bridge chipset and the South Bridge chipset. The North Bridge chipset is also known as a memory controller hub and the South Bridge chipset is known as input-output controller hub. So I will tell information it's combined. We can see that in below diagram, the North Bridge chipset is responsible for the managing high-speed communication between the CPU to memory and the graphics card. It also handles the communication between the CPU and the South Bridge chipset. The South Bridge chipset, on the other hand, manages the communication between the CPU and lower speed peripheral devices such as hard drives, USB ports, network interference, and audio devices. It also provides supports for functions such as power management system monitoring, and input-output operations. The North Bridge chipset is responsible for managing high-speed communication between CPU and also responsible for determining the maximum amount of RAM that can be installed in a system as well as the type of RAM that can be used. Additionally, manages the communication between the CPU and the South Bridge chipset. The South Bridge chipset, on the other hand, manages the communication between the CPU and the lower speed peripheral devices such as hard drives. So, the South Bridge chipset also provides supports of various input-output operations such as USB, firewire ports, serials, and parallel ports. So, we can say that the North Bridge chipset handles the high-speed communication between the CPU and the South Bridge chipset handles the lower speed communication that is provided by the system. However, with the advancement of technology, many modern motherboards and integrated functionalities are available in market. So the North Bridge and the South Bridge into a single chipset is also known as a platform controller hub, that is PCH. Thank you.
Hello, I am Omkar Award from Group 1 and I'll be explaining some parts of the motherboard. So we'll begin with the cooling fans which are used in the motherboard. As we can see here, if I zoom in a little bit, CPU fans, there are generally more than one types of fans. So cooling fans are used to cool down the temperature of the whole system. There are three types of cooling fans we majorly come upon. The first type of cooling fan is the axial cooling fan, which by its word we understand the direction of the airflow is parallel to the shaft about which the blade moves. So this kind of fans are used in CPU and other areas. We'll talk about that shortly. Second type of fans are called as centrifugal cooling fans. The direction of the air through this fan is perpendicular to the shaft. And there are third types of fans which are used in the motherboard. They're called as blowers. And the primary function of the blower is to direct the air towards the CPU so that it can cool down the temperature that is there. Now various types of locations on a motherboard needs a cooling fan. For example, the PSU of motherboard, that is the power supply unit. It requires fan for cooling down its temperature. Then there are areas like CPU, which is basically requires the fan because it controls the whole procedure of the system. And then there are for areas like graphic cards where we use the fan because nowadays in PCs a lot of high tech games are available. So when the user is playing games of high end, then a lot of amount of heat is generated. Even the heat surpasses the amount of heat produced by the CPU. In that case, we require fans in the motherboard. Then now we'll look at the connectors for integrated peripherals. Now these kind of ports, they are used to connect some external devices to the motherboard. For example, the PS2. Now this is the PlayStation, which was a second module quite back in the time. Now there are PS4, PS5s, advanced versions of it. And then again, they were used for this kind of peripheral connectors are used for keyboards and mouse, and serial ports, parallel ports, USBs, and then Ethernet audio. We can access a lot of things with this kind of connectors. So they're used in the motherboard to connect external devices. Thank you.
All components and external peripheral connect. Motherboard can be found in a virtual all computers, especially desktop and laptop PCs. The components that connect through them include chipset, central processing unit, and memory. What do a motherboard do? It is a circuit board that connects all the hardware to your processor, distributes electricity from your power supply, and defines the type of storage device, memory modules, and graphic cards that can connect to your PC. Now, the history of our motherboard. In 1981, IBM introduced the first modern day motherboard called a planar. It was the first board that housed the CPU, RAM, and other components together on the same board. In 1984, IBM then introduced their new 80 from fractal motherboard. The IBM had become a widely copied design in a booming home computer market of the 1980s. In 1987, a large version of the original 80 motherboard called the BB80 was introduced in 1987. It was the first PC motherboard to have built-in sockets for I/O port like serial and parallel. In 1994, developed by Intel in 1995, the motherboard which replaced the popular BB80 form factor and defined what the motherboard would look like for the next few decades was the ATX form factor. Now the types of motherboard. First, the advanced technology motherboard. Due to their large physical dimension, these motherboards do not work properly with computers that fall into the category of smaller desktop. Large physical size make it more difficult to install new hardware. The second type is standard ATX motherboard. In this, ATX is an enhanced version of a 80 motherboard. It named Advanced Technology Extend and it initial stand for Advanced Technology. Third, micro ATX motherboard. Users who do not want excessive connection and upgrades like adding more RAM and extra GPU or other peripheral interconnects card are better suited for this kind of motherboard than others. extended ATX motherboard. This motherboard supports a single or a twin CPU configuration and has up to 8 RAM slots. Flex ATX motherboard. These ATX form factor mainboard do not enjoy the same degree of popularity as their ATX form factor contemporary. 6. Low profile extended motherboard. 7. BTX motherboard. Balanced technology extend average at BTX. 9.